Now we're going to talk about LGBTQ issues in comics. And that topic has kind of woven in and out of our discussions so far. We've talked about some individuals like Patricia Highsmith and Marcia Snyder who were openly gay or bisexual, and like Matt Baker, who never came out but who many people assumed was gay. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. If he had lived past 1959 and the age of 37 and into an era when things could be discussed more openly, we might know the answer to that. But nonetheless, I don't want to go through a list of comic book writers and artists from the Golden Age or the Silver Age or beyond who might or might not have been gay or queer or anything fitting in the LGBTQ um, um, umbrella, under that umbrella. That's kind of I feel like a pointless exercise. Uh, More recently, I think that what we'll do is when it comes to individuals is we will look at individuals who have come out and who have written about specifically about LGBTQ themes in their work. Now, that wasn't done openly in the Golden Age. It wasn't done almost at all after the Comics Code Authority. Remember all of those moral restrictions that were placed, and homosexuality was regarded as immoral, and comic books were regarded as children's literature. So there was a close watch kept by the censors. For the most part, not much slipped by them. Before those censors were in place, before the mid 1950s, every once in a while in the Golden Age, there might be the insinuation that a character might be homosexual, and it was almost always a villain, and that implication was made to show just how wicked and depraved they were. And actually, more often than not, it would be a Chinese villain, male or female. However, even those sorts of things were done very, very, very subtly after the Comics Code Authority was established. Any kind of reference had to be very, very oblique. Well, okay, maybe all of them weren't that subtle. But when the underground comics movement started, they were not beholden to any Comics Code Authority or anything else. They could write and draw basically whatever the heck they wanted to. They were, in most cases, selling it themselves personally. And when that got underway in the late 60s, it wasn't long at all before, drug use, profanity, and explicit sex all those things were common in underground comics. And it didn't take long at all for homosexual activities to be presented as well. The first time in the underground comics movement that gay sex was mentioned and even shown was in issue 3 of Zap Comics in 1968, when S. Clay Wilson had this strip in there, this comic strip. I think it appeared more than once. Captain Pissgums and his pervert pirates. Now, it was all played for laughs and shock value. There was no effort to make a statement about homosexuality, positive or negative. It was just, being as gross as possible. So the captain and his pirates were just engaging in all kinds of what society would consider lewd behavior, including openly sexual activities with one another. That sort of opened the door for other artists to portray such things. And over the next several years, when the underground comics movement was at its height in the early 70s. So 1968 to about 1975. There were not infrequent references to homosexuality and occasionally even portrayals of gay sex, but usually it was done in a way that was making fun of gay people and playing to a lot of stereotypes and often even being cruel. Homophobic would be the word for it, for the most part, with some exceptions. And one major exception we talked about earlier when we were discussing women in comics, and Trina Robbins, who in the very first issue of Women's Comics in 1972 had a story called Sandy Comes Out, which was the very first comic book story or character about an openly gay person portrayed in a positive light, and the first ever discussion of coming out of the closet. And she wrote that, got a lot of attention, especially among other artists in the movement and people who were following underground comics. Now, Trina Robbins was straight, and she was writing a story, about something that she thought was important, but that she did not understand firsthand. Mary Wings took exception to some of the things in Robin's story for being inauthentic and not true to life and not having the ring of veracity. So she did her own comic about coming out called Come Out Comics, which sounds like it's going to be a series, but it was only a one-shot thing that she did. Immediately started working on it when she saw Trina Robbins' story came out later in 1972. Later, Roberta Gregory, another gay artist, wrote the title Dynamite Damsels, which was a continuing series. This was the first continuing comic book series to star a gay character, and that character was Bitchy Bitch, as opposed to Richie Rich. That was 1976. Also in 1976, Larry Fuller. Do you remember him? He was the African-American artist who created the superhero, the satirical superhero Eben. He published and edited a series called Gay Heartthrobs in 1976, which only had 3 or 4 issues because sales weren't that great. But it's still significant because it was the first, gay-centric comic book series in which all the stories were either by or about, and usually both, gay people. Usually, not always gay men. But when that fell by the wayside, that torch was picked up in 1980 by Gay Comics, which also had, it was an anthology series, men and women contributing to it, including Mary Wing and Roberta Gregory and others. And most of the stories in there, I don't think that there may have been some series, but for the most part, they were self-contained stories. Most of them were either humorous or were autobiographical by the artists. And this lasted for 18 years. It was in print until 1998. Meanwhile, though, over in mainstream comics, you aren't seeing anything like this, for sure. Not even into the 1980s. Jim Shooter, we'll talk about him later, who was the editor-in-chief of Marvel Comics from the late 70s through the mid to late 1980s. He had an absolutely no gay storyline policy, and even if he had allowed such a thing, it would not have gotten past the censors, probably. which is why it's interesting what happened with in the pages of Captain America. This took place in a multi-part story that was leading up to the conclusion of the story in issue 300 of Captain America. This was in 1985, during a time when the CCA was still in full force and Jim Shooter's no gay plot lines or even references in force as well. And in the story, there had been a supporting character introduced several issues before this, named Arnie Roth, who was Steve Rogers, that's Captain America, Steve Rogers' next door neighbor, and he lived with his roommate, Michael. Well, as part of this storyline, Arnie gets kidnapped by Captain America's enemies, which are the Red Skull, former Nazi from World War II, and Baron Zemo, son of the original Baron Zemo, former Nazi from World War II. And among other things, there was a part where Arnie was being forced by them to say these things, including that he was a freak, and that people like him deserved to be in a concentration camp. And then when Captain America comes in and rescues him, he says, "You're as good and decent a man as I've ever known. They can't corrupt your love for Michael with their lies any more than they can corrupt my love for Bernie. Do you hear me, Arnie? They're the pariahs. They're the disease." Now, when he says his love for Bernie, that doesn't mean that, that they were so progressive they thought they could slip something by with Captain America, nor is he talking about Bernie Sanders. He's talking about Bernadette, or is it Bernice? It was Bernice Rosenthal, who was Captain America's girlfriend in the 80s. Anyway, this very clearly, you read the story and you can see very clearly that Arnie is gay and that he's being targeted by these Nazis. And Captain America is telling him that none of that stuff is true and that his love for Michael is pure. And that did slip by. The censors didn't notice it. None of the people higher up at Marvel, like Jim Shooter, noticed it because it never said the word gay. Certainly didn't say the word homosexual. It was just sort of context evidence. And so that is actually one of the bolder instances of being able to get some references to gayness into the mainstream comics. Until the 1990s, the early 90s, Jim Shooter was long gone from Marvel. He was now over at Valiant, and times were changing. In the March 1992 issue of Alpha Flight, which is the Canadian superhero team, one of the members of Alpha Flight, North Star, came out as gay. Now, the cover, North Star as you've never known him before. According to his creator, John Byrne, who had created this team when he was working on X-Men, his intention was that North Star was gay from the very beginning when he introduced the characters in 1979. They just couldn't say so. But now they were saying so, and that got a lot of news coverage, a lot of attention. I remember hearing about it on the news, gay superhero. Marvel did, however, get some criticism from the gay community in the years after that because they made the big announcement and then never mentioned it again, basically, or didn't for a long time. But that finally changed. And in 2004, in the pages of Astonishing X-Men, North Star married his boyfriend, the first gay wedding in mainstream comics. So that was a major turning point right there. And kind of tucked away and hardly noticeable the very same month as North Star making his big announcement over in DC Comics in their imprint Vertigo, which is for mature readers. The character John Constantine, who he'd been around since 1985. He had debuted in the pages of Swamp Thing. He's kind of like a mystical detective sort of character. Anyway, just in this random issue, as he's thinking to himself as he's in the laundromat. I should count myself lucky. Don't have many old friends left. Girlfriends, the odd boyfriend, all have a nasty habit of walking out on me. Thereby giving the first acknowledgement that John Constantine is bisexual, something which in later years became an established part of his character in the comics and also on television. But as of 1992, it was no longer a taboo thing in mainstream comics to even mention sexual preference or issues like that. And slowly, as the 90s unfolded, you saw more and more instances of supporting characters who were gay. And then after the year 2000, especially in the past decade, from 2010 until now in 2020, there have been an increasingly large number of mainstream comics characters who are LGBTQ, and over in DC, they have sort of retconned some of their characters, some of their established characters, because they've retconned their whole universe like twice, 2 or 3 times in the last 10 years. But now you have well-established characters who, in the comics, have always been gay or bisexual. Wonder Woman is now openly acknowledged as being a bisexual person. The original Green Lantern, the original Golden Age era Green Lantern, it has been retroactively written, was gay the whole time through all of his early adventures. And because they've retconned the universe, it doesn't even require an announcement in the new version of the universe. Everyone just knows that. And wouldn't that be nice? Now that I think about it, wouldn't it be nice to have that sort of change that doesn't even have to be announced? It's just, everyone all of a sudden has always known that these things are part of the human condition and don't judge people because of it. That's a pleasant thought. Anyway, this, along with all the other forms of diversity that we've discussed, more female writers and artists and female characters, more characters from different minority groups, more characters that are not sort of heteronormative cis white males, are part of the thing that have driven a small percentage of the comic book fan population just out of their minds angry, but they're a minority. They're a minority, and they either forget or are not aware that so far as the humanity of this, queer people and Latinx people, Asian Americans, black people, Native American Indians have been involved in the comic book business behind the scenes since it began in one form or another. And it is only fitting that they be more visible up front now. And when you get outside the framework of Marvel and DC and Image and Dark Horse and the other major publishers today of serial comic books, graphic novels, which have become an art form separate from comics, although they developed from from comic books. Graphic novels and independent comics have given lots of opportunities in this 21st century, in the last 20 years or so, for LGBTQ people to be involved as artists and writers and tell their own stories, or just tell stories in general with, infusing it with their own character and personality. And probably the most prominent example of this is Alison Bechtel, who we talked about earlier, whose graphic novel Fun Home was such a huge critical success, talking about her childhood and her trying to discover herself and who she is and her sexuality and so forth. And there have been a large number of people who have written that kind of thing, the kind of thing that 40 years ago might have been serialized in the comic gay comics, but would not have been published, as a standalone thing to be in bookstores 40 years ago. I would also mention Colleen Coover, who has been involved in the comic book end of things. In recent years, she has worked on several mainstream Marvel and DC books, but back in 2000, the year 2000, she started a comic book, an independent comic book called Small Favors. That was, it was kind of tongue-in-cheek erotic lesbian graphic storytelling, and it was very entertaining and amusing, and despite its very graphic nature, it was even kind of cute. Anyway, point is, there are a lot of opportunities out there now to discover different perspectives. I want to close out by looking at two 21st century efforts by the big two publishers, Marvel and DC, to capture that perspective. The first one, in the year 2003, involves the Marvel Western character, the Rawhide Kid, who had been around for over 50 years at that point. And we'll talk more about the Rawhide Kid under the Western genre part. But a miniseries was released in 2003 that revealed the Rawhide Kid was gay. It was written by Ron Zimmerman, who was not a comic book writer. He was actually a television writer and occasional actor, best known for his appearance on shock jock Howard Stern's radio program, which could get pretty raunchy. And the art was by John Severin, who had done a good deal of the artwork in the original Rawhide Kid series back in the 1950s and 60s. Well, this garnered a lot of publicity and attention. It was in the newspapers and on the news, and I remember seeing Stan Lee on CNN talking with Larry King about this bold move. But if you actually read the story, which was called Slap Leather, you'll find that that it's really like a very broad parody. It reminds me of the old late 70s George Hamilton movie Zorro the Gay Blade, if you've ever seen or heard of that, in the sense that it's played for laughs, and the Rawhide Kid is presented with just these really, really stereotypically gay quirks and a lot of insinuations and jokes, and it's, well, not to be taken seriously, Is it offensive? I guess it's in the eyes of the viewer. In some ways, I think this series might have been interpreted as offensive by both ends of the ideological spectrum, right? Because some people were just upset that Marvel was gaying up one of their cowboy characters, while those on the other end of the spectrum might have been upset by the really biased way that they seemed to be doing it. Um, you could look at it as not being unlike the TV show Will and Grace, though, which was a very important moment in television, so far as having a gay lead character. But it's personally, I'm uncomfortable reading it because it just seems kind of insulting. But again, I suppose it's in the eye of the beholder. Now, the other thing that I wanted to look at came 15 years after that in 2018, and it came from DC. Now, DC had acquired the rights to the Hanna-Barbera cartoon characters, which were the TV characters that were very popular starting in the late 1950s all the way into the 80s, which characters like Yogi Bear and Scooby-Doo. And they had already released one comic book series that took these characters and put them in a more serious light. But this one in particular that I'm going to focus on deals with the character Snagglepuss, who debuted on television in 1959. Snagglepuss is a pink mountain lion. I wasn't alive in 1959, but I remember Snagglepuss from my childhood for being one of the commentators on the Laugh Olympics in 1976. Anyway, the character, as it was presented on television, had a very distinctive voice.
Snagglepuss. Oh, would that I were free, unfettered and uncaged. To think that I, king of the jungle, should be so lowly treated. Besides, the food is abominable. But hark! Or is it hurt? The cage door is open. Ajar even. What a chintzy outfit. Can't even afford a lock. So exit. Stage left.
The 2018 miniseries from DC was titled Exit Stage Left, The Snagglepuss Chronicles. Exit Stage Left was Snagglepuss's tagline in the TV show. And like the earlier series about the Flintstones, this was written by Mark Russell. The Flintstones, by the way, played very, very seriously. Had a lot to say about wartime trauma and about pursuing the American dream and so forth. In the Snagglepuss series, the character was reimagined as a 1950s playwright who is flamboyantly, although not officially out, gay. And he's the subject of a witch hunt by the House Un-American Activities Committee, who are leaning on him, trying to get him to name names of other gay people in the cartoon entertainment business. And that's the crux. That's the main plot. But it sort of follows not only Snagglepuss, who is supposed to be a playwright from Mississippi, very obviously modeled on Tennessee Williams. Also on a couple of his friends, the cartoon characters Huckleberry Hound and Quick Draw McGraw, who are also, although much more secretly, gay. And things happen like visits to Stonewall, the gay bar that was operating in 1950s New York City, and it is, You think that, well, this is a TV cartoon, so you perhaps expect a certain type of storytelling. But this is in many ways the opposite of the Rawhide Kid thing from Marvel years earlier, because the Rawhide Kid, I feel, took a very traditional Western character and made him into a parody of gayness. And it could have been, I feel, done much better if it had been played more seriously, the Rawhide Kid thing. It could have been profound. Instead, it was silly and kind of insulting. But it was the opposite of what you expected that kind of made it stand out. This also is opposite from what you expect, in the opposite direction. Because, funny cartoon characters from television, and the storyline and the characterization and the dialogue are not cartoony at all. Very, very serious, very well done, and like the Flintstones series that Russell wrote, very, very powerful, and very poignant, and one of the best things I've read in comic book form since the Flintstones, which is, again, not what you expect to be saying, but it's true, and I highly recommend it for presenting a serious and sensitive and, like I said, powerful and poignant look at being gay in the 1950s.